Welcome everyone to another community practice version of my observability clinics. It's episode 3 actually, and we hear a lot today about, as you can see, SSL certificates and some tagging. I am always inviting people that actually know how to use Dynatrace really well because they use it on a day in and day out basis. Today, my guest is Reinhard Weber. Servus, Reinhard, how are you?
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great and really looking forward to doing this performance clinic together.
Yeah. And thank you so much for doing this. I know that you are obviously a long-term Dynatrace user. You're one of the dynamites. We used to work together, which was really great. And now you're doing your own thing. Can you quickly tell the people 360 Performance, just a little bit background about you before we go into the topic?
Sure. As you can see, we still work together.
Yeah.
Just from a different angle now. No, I used to work at Dynatrace for about 8 years together with Andy. I think we also spent some time in the same office.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still working with Dynatrace. I'm now an independent Dynatrace consulting company at 360 Performance. I mainly work with large customers, so large Dynatrace deployments. And as Andy already said, I'm a long-term Dynatrace user actually from before Dynatrace when it was still called Admon. Yeah, and I kept using this great product. So I'm still on Dynatrace and I'm on fire on exploring new things with Dynatrace and making things possible with Dynatrace.
Perfect. So folks, if you're listening in and you want to learn more, you can see the links on the bottom. Also, I will post a lot of links in the description of the video, both from YouTube and Dynatrace University. But now, Reinhard, tell us, what tips and tricks have you prepared for us today?
Yeah, I want to talk about 2 topics. One is a long-term a wish list item on Dynatrace side that goes back a couple of years and that actually made me implementing this in Dynatrace. Now there's also support, which is SSL Certificate Monitoring, which is like a highly sought for feature in Dynatrace for a long time. And the other one is, you probably all know the tagging features in Dynatrace and the power of tagging. And I want to show a couple of tricks that you can do with tagging and how you can tag entities and services in Dynatrace to make your life easier.
Awesome. Then let's go into it.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with certificate monitoring, and I call it advanced expiration monitoring of certificates. That's topic number 1. Topic number 2, as I said, advanced tagging. SSL certificates. Why do you want to monitor SSL certificate? This seems very logical to do, and of course, you want to always make sure that you have valid certificates to avoid any hijacking of your sites, to avoid any leaking of confidential data and so on, right? Today you have certificates or services that are getting equipped with certificates in a dynamic way. Let's take Let's Encrypt, for example, where you have your services running and you have an extra service that refreshes your certificates. It's not the normal case anymore that you buy a certificate that is valid for 10 or even more years. And then you deploy it on your web server and always stays the same. Today, you mostly have certificates that have shorter expiry dates, but they should always be valid, right? So you want to make sure that your certificates are valid and that your users are not getting surprised with a warning in browsers that today enforce encrypted communication, that your connection is not private, right? So those certificates should be refreshed hopefully automatically. Lots of services, as I said, are using Let's Encrypt today, where you basically have a bot running that refreshes your services. And of course, those certificates should always match the CN or common name of the server or the service it protects, right? If you today enter an address in your browser and you get a warning like the one shown in the screenshot below, every user or most of the users are already aware, oh, there could be something wrong, something fishy, and they would maybe not visit your site. So losing a valid certificate means basically downtime because your users will turn away. That's why you want to monitor certificates, right? Mm-hmm. And you today have 2 options in Dynatrace to monitor or validate your certificates via synthetic monitors. So for some time now, Dynatrace directly supports monitoring certificate expiration dates within the synthetic monitors that you can configure, be it HTTP monitors or browser monitors. When I started implementing this certificate validation plugin, this feature was not there yet, right? Today it is there, which is good. But there are still some things that you might consider over using synthetic monitors or this advanced certificate check plugin, because typically you execute your synthetic monitor, let's say, for purpose of uptime measurements, right? But it's not required to check a certificate every minute or every 5 minutes, right? Typically, certificates have an expiration time of, or validity time of days, weeks, months, maybe some even still years. So it's not necessarily required to check the validity of a certificate every minute, every 5 minutes, right? You don't do that as frequently as synthetic tests. As I said, the support was missing for a long time. A couple of years back, when I started thinking about this plugin, or actually implemented the first versions of it, Dynatrace did not have this certificate expiry check. So we needed another solution that works on a large scale. And the other limitation that Dynatrace out of the box has, there is no other validation of certificates. So common name verification. Does the certificate actually match the host name that you're accessing to? So for example, if you go to google.com and you get a certificate that is actually valid in time, it could still be a fake certificate that is actually not built for Google.com, but for something else, right? This kind of validation is not done. The screenshot here, you see that for example, the Google.com certificate has alternative names, right? The certificate is a so-called wildcard certificate. It has alternative names in the certificate as well. So it doesn't only match www.google.com or maps Google.com. It also matches YouTube, Google.com, and so on, right? A star certificate. The plugin that I've implemented does also do a host name verification, right? It checks if the site that it accesses and the certificate it gets back does actually match the name that you use to access the site, right? The plugin that I built basically seamlessly integrates with the existing synthetic monitors that you might have already configured, right? You configure your monitors for uptime measurement, for performance measurements, and this ActiveGate plugin uses the API, checks the monitors, gets the monitors, performs extended certificate checks, host name validation, expiry date validation, and then uses this information to create problems on the Dynatrace side. Another nice thing is if you use this with synthetic monitors that are already included, this plugin does not create any metrics. Basically, it does not create any metrics. There's an option which we will see later, and it does not consume any license check. It does not create any synthetic monitors that aren't there, no extra synthetic monitors. It doesn't consume any Davis data units, for example. And it scales. This was built for large-scale deployments. So there's a couple of tricks that I wanna share that you can use in an ActiveGates plugin, also in this certificate checker plugin, right? It runs on an ActiveGate and it uses the Dynatrace API, not only what you can do out of the Python library that you're using to implement this plugin, not the extension library, but it can obviously also through the ActiveGate it runs on access the Dynatrace API, and with that you have like all the power of the API available. You don't need to configure any firewall rules to access your Dynatrace cluster. You just use the local ActiveGate API to access the Dynatrace API to get the existing monitor configurations, to determine what should be checked, to host events, problems, to also eventually read any any other information that it might need regarding the synthetic check execution and so on. It uses the event API and problem API to generate problems and update the problems. So it's not only a static problem that says, hey, today at 10 p.m. I checked the certificate and it reported it's only valid for 6 more days. It will, if it checks tomorrow, perform the same check and update the problem and say, hey, now it's only valid for 5 more days or 4 more days, and basically get a countdown in the problem. If somebody opens the problem, there will be an update in the time how long the certificate is still valid or how long you have to check it. It also has or supports long check intervals, not those 1-minute checks that you typically have in synthetic monitors, but up to 24 hours or even more, to say, well, okay, I only perform every midnight or every week or whatever to check your certificates to avoid unnecessary checks. As I said, this might not be relevant if you do this for 1 or 2 synthetic tests or checks, but if you have hundreds of those, you just avoid unnecessary checks and unnecessary traffic to the sites. It works with disabled synthetic monitors. So if you have hundreds of endpoints that you want to check where you maybe do not want to perform synthetic tests or performance tests against, maybe because they are not even in your domain and not your responsibility, you could create a synthetic monitor, disable it so that it never runs, and this basically serves as a configuration for the certificate checker plugin. It gets this disabled monitor, reads the configuration, performs the check, right? It also works on generic SSL connections. So you could, for example, also create a synthetic monitor that you would never execute because it, for example, checks the SSL connection on a email service, right? Where you don't have a website or anything like that, where you typically would not use a browser to connect to or get, but it's just like a generic endpoint port 993 for encrypted SMTP. You could configure that and the plugin would still try to do or perform a generic SSL connection, get the certificate, and perform the check. And a nice thing that is also, that actually came along as a feature request or as a discussion in the community around this plugin, to make it configurable via tags on the synthetic monitors. So you don't use the typical plugin configuration in the Dynatrace settings where only admins maybe have access to, right? But you allow users to configure the plugin execution via tags on a specific synthetic monitor, right? We will see that that's kind of a link in to the other topic where I talk about tags, and we will see that live how this actually works.
Cool.
Okay, let's jump in and see this thing in action. That's always better than just talking about it. How does this actually work? So this is my partner demo environment, and as you can see, I have a couple of synthetic monitors configured. One of them is my Dynatrace consolidation API, which is just a basic HTTP test that is performed every minute. Actually, it's on demand only. I changed it to on demand. I do have another synthetic monitor configuration, one, for example, for Google.com. Yeah, I want to check Google.com. This monitor is disabled, so it's not active, right? It's inactive and it didn't execute. Then our own websites, a couple of synthetic checks are configured. My own Home Assistant instance, for example, as well, that is an active monitor that executes every 1 minute from one location. And all those synthetic monitors or sites that I want to perform an SSL check against have tags assigned, right? So they have like a tag that is called SSL check, They have also configuration tags assigned, SSL check expire. So I want to have like a 30 days expiry warning on this one. And I need to perform the check via a proxy, right? The other ones might have different expiry dates. So for example, my check against Google does have an expiry date of 90 days, right? I could go into the plugin configuration, set a default expiry date, but I can override this with my configuration tags. So basically, if I go to my settings, I do have one configuration only for this plugin. And this says, please check every synthetic monitor that has this SSL check tag applied. Consider that one for checking the certificate there. It has a default expiration day, right? And it has an interval of 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes, my plugin will perform checks against all synthetic monitors that are tagged. If there's no configuration tag of the expiry date, then it will use the default. If there is an expiry configuration tag applied, it will use the one day. And as you can see, the interval can be changed from 5 minutes to 24 hours. That's just a setting where the plugin will still run every minute, as ActiveGate plugins actually do, but it will not execute anything if it's not 15 minutes after 9 or 15 or 30 minutes after 9 and so on, right? Or at midnight every day. So with that configuration, I will get warnings about any certificate issues, right? As you can see here, I just yesterday set the expiration date for google.com to 90 days. They actually are always around 60 days. So Google quite often refreshes the certificate. That's quite interesting. So I changed that to 90 days, so I should get an error warning. And now I do get this problem created by Dynatrace, posted to basically the synthetic monitor google.com, and I see all the details that, well, maybe not all the details a certificate can hold, but the important ones, right? I see the alternative names that are configured on the certificate. I see that this plugin also performed a hostname verification, so that actually the maps.google.com or www.google.com that I use for the check is found in the alternative names of the certificate. So it matches not only google.com, but started to google.com, and the synthetic test that was performed against maps.google.com is found in the alternative names, right? And it will expire in 60 days. And I get the not before, not after dates of the certificate when it has been created and when it will expire.
That is pretty cool. Just wanted to say I kept quiet because I learned a lot already, and this is really nice. Especially I like it how you did it with the tags on the synthetic, because you're basically reusing existing configuration like synthetic tests, and then say, hey, the plugin is basically taking the synthetic test configuration as input for what SSL checks you want to validate do. That's really nicely done.
Yeah, if you work with hundreds of synthetic tests that maybe have been configured or that are under control of users, where I cannot make sure that they actually would now available feature of SSL check enable that, and you still have, like, let's imagine you're responsible for all the certificates in the company, right? And you're not responsible for the uptime or performance monitoring. Then this approach seemed logical, that you take what is there and reuse what is already there, and if anyone adds a new synthetic monitor, it's automatically monitored.
Perfect. I also want to quickly highlight, folks, if you're listening in, the plugin that Reinhard is using here, the Advanced SSL Certificate Check, can be found on the hub, and I will also put a link to that hub listing into the description of the video, so it's easier for you to find.
Fantastic, thanks, Andy. I mentioned before actually that it doesn't consume DDUs. that's not true always for every configuration, because if you have been looking at the configuration of the plugin, there is also an option that says report certificate expiry days as metrics to Dynatrace. What this basically does, it will create a custom metric. If you need, you can of course enable and disable it. And basically it will, just out of interest, and it's sometimes quite interesting to say, to see when certificates do get expired or did not get expired. So what this feature flag does is just create a metric that, I use the minimum here normally, that basically reports when certificates are being automatically renewed, right? So it will not only, if there is an alert, basically when your certificate goes under the threshold, create an alert, but you could also on a large scale view see, okay, my certificates do get renewed regularly and correctly, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, in my case, I had a couple of cases in my setup where I did not renew it in time, where my automatic renewal failed. I did get a problem back then, but now I can also see for how long I did not renew it, right? How long did it stay in an error state? That's also quite interesting use case, that the certificate here for my API Dynatrace it did not get renewed for 19 days, right? Vacation. I did not manually renew it. That's another option. It's not mandatory to have this metric, but it's sometimes quite interesting. And as you can see, Google.com obviously always refreshes them quite early, right? So there could be like a week refreshing around 60 days. It gets refreshed and it only has a very short duration period. Quite interesting.
Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, as Andy said, it is available in the hub. There's also a very long community thread where I once consolidated all the different approaches of certificate checks, and I'm regular posting updates there if a new release has been provided and so on. So it's actively maintained, and quite interesting discussions there, and feature requests and good ideas that I'm trying to put into the plugin as well.
And I will also put a link to that community post. I just found it. It's called the Configuration-less Advanced SSL Certificate plugin. You're right, it has 70 comments and discussions. It's great. Thank you, Reinhard. Really cool.
All right. So far for the certificate plugin, we also scratched already some topics on what I want to show in the advanced tagging, right? The idea of configure plugins or maybe other things, even via tags, that was something that originated from the discussion of the certificate checker plugin. And there's another one that I also got great feedback on, I want to share with you, is using the entity relationships of the Dynatrace entity model for automated tagging of entities, with a typo in here. But that's also quite interesting and received a lot of great feedback. So we talked about this already. Just to summarize it up again, you might not have access, or your users might not have access to plugin configuration on a global level. So you can delegate the configuration for at least some parts for plugins to tags, right? So that was quite interesting and useful to not need to maintain different endpoint configuration, but just use tags to make this a little bit more dynamic. Just to summarize, yeah, the plugin supports 3 different types: the expiry date, a proxy, and should it generally be considered. That's just an example to use key value tags for configuration. Obviously, you have to standardize on the tag key, and your plugin needs to be aware of that. The other thing that is quite let's say a powerful feature within Dynatrace that's maybe not too well known is entity relationships and tagging rules for entity relationships. So just to a quick recap, what are entity relationships? These are the dependencies between all entities in Dynatrace, so be it services, infrastructure entities, application entities, host groups, processes. So this whole entity model that if you look at the smartscape, see on the different levels, but there's even more behind that, is stored in Dynatrace, and it is dynamic, right? And the reason why this dynamic is important there is because sometimes you cannot directly, well, let's put it the other way. I've received requests from some of my customers to say, okay, which services are actually used by my web application, right? Which services are depending on other services, not directly, but also indirectly. And the answer to this question in modern architectures changes from time to time, right? Because services get refactored. Somebody in a different area might deploy new services. They might decompose a monolith into microservices, and suddenly the Dynatrace entity model changes again, and you cannot really answer, yes, they are all responsible and provide information to this web application. And I receive questions, hey, I want to see in one view, I want to have in one management zone, for example, all the entities, all the services, all the infrastructure, all the Kubernetes clusters or namespaces that are contributing to my web application, right? Mm-hmm. So basically tagging dynamically down from the browser to services, and use that for alerting, adding to management zones, and so on, right? And then there's also the case, now Dynatrace improved that also a little bit, to tag entities that have no tagging support, right? So for example, container group instances. I was in a situation with a customer where they really wanted to know metrics about their containers, and they were working with management zones, but they could never go down to the container level because there was no tagging support for container levels, right? Mm-hmm. And these relationship rules allowed me to address those two use cases. And the interesting thing here is that even I had to learn is not to think about tags as a one-shot rule, right? You create the tag, it's evaluated, and the matching entities that you see on the preview entities tab, for example, is what you finally get as a result, right? It's actually, you have to think more iterative, as an iterative process, and this is what I wanted to describe here. So in my tag, I have the use case exactly as I described it. I have a service, and I wanna see all the services that depend on that service, right? So the tagging rules that I created are actually 5 or 6 different tagging rules, and they are applied one after another. I call it a so-called tag unfolding, right? It wraps, or it unfolds over the time only, and you cannot directly see it when you create the tagging rule itself. So the first rule that is important is what I call a tag entry point, so to say, right? You tag the application, and that's basically the only thing that you eventually want to do manually or via such a rule. You take the application, the web application, and it has a name, so, and it will receive a tag, right? Service area, for example. Mm-hmm. And once this application is tagged, if you would hit, or if you have this rule in there and you would say preview, you would only see the application being tagged with this rule, nothing else, right? But as soon as Dynatrace applies this rule, all the other rules start kicking in, right? Via these relationships. So rule number 2 will then use the entity relationships on the application that is calling a service, right? Or all the services that are being called by this application, and the application needs to be tagged with the service area econ, right? So only once the application is tagged, this tagging rule will start kicking in and consider rule number 2 and start tagging all the services, all the direct services that are being used by the application, right? And then the next rule kicks in once those services are being tagged. In large environments, Dynatrace can take a little bit to do that. The next rule kicks in, right? It takes all the services that are being called by the services that you just have tagged with rule number 2, right? So you get the second level services that are being used by the application. And of course, this rule is applied multiple times, right? Because once those servers are being tagged, the next services are being tagged, and you basically have this whole unfolding going. But it might take a little bit, right? And then you can go on, and this might even run in parallel, so to say already. Now you take all the hosts that services are executing on that have received this tag already, right? And this is by rule number 4, and rule number 4 are in here twice. And you also do the same for process groups, right? And then finally you have the process groups. You use the relationships, this instance of a process group, you tag the individual processes. And you can basically use all the relationships, and there's a long list of different entity types that have different relationships. You can use like all these relationships to go down in the infrastructure, to go up, to go in basically any direction.
This is brilliant. Wow, this is really cool. Because it took me a while to fully understand it, but basically, if I look at the service flow, and I think you will show this maybe later on anyway, but you one of your rules starts to put a tag on an entity, and then the next rule kicks in because it was looking for a certain entity with that tag, and then it tags itself, and then the next one. This is really awesome. And the use case, I like the use case a lot because I hear this as well, where people say, hey, I have an app and I want to make sure I have a management zone for people that should only see the stuff that belongs to that app. But I don't know, because it's a very dynamic environment. So I want Dynatrace to figure this out for me. And I really like this. This is really nice.
Yeah, often you if you think about tagging rules, you say, well, okay, you look at the moment right now, what services, which services are there and how they're being used, right? But imagine you're doing refactoring in the back end, or some other service owner that didn't even know about, right? Just starts refactoring and introduces new services and new dependencies. You have this great dynamic dependency model in Dynatrace to detect all these dependencies. But as you said, management zone is one of the key requests that I also had for this, just as you described, right? I want to see everything that contributes to my application to maybe detect the problems properly and so on, right? And once you have those rules in place, you can create such management zones. There's a little improvement that would make sense there. In management zones, you only have those entity selector rules, but you always have to specify the type, right? You need to create a management zone where you definitely specify which entity types you want to have in there. Yep. Makes sense, but sometimes you even want to have like, okay, the types that you don't even know of, right? So imagine you have a management zone created like this, where I say, well, I want to have all process groups, hosts, application, process group instances, and services as viewable by my users. But then suddenly someone introduces a synthetic monitor for this application, and you haven't created the rule or that matching rule in the management zone yet. So I think it would make sense to have like a generic entity select for management selection that would make that really, really powerful. And then say just any entity that is tagged with this dynamic tag from the previous rules should land in that management zone. So if somebody, for example, decomposes a monolith that runs on physical or virtual machines or bare metal machines into a Kubernetes service, you eventually want to have also your containers in there, right? If you don't know that it's being decomposed, you don't need to adapt the management zone rule. If you say type, any entity type that is tagged should belong to the management zone. So in reality, this would look like this. This is an example from my customer. And as you can see, I started at the web application, and if you go down, there's services over services down to the back end, down eventually to a database, right? And for most of the people that want to have any notification about the application or any visibility on the application, where and why it fails, what contributes to that application, would like to have all these services included with the tags. And not only those services, but also the underlying infrastructure potentially. Mm-hmm. And this can get complex, right? And this is what we solve with that way of tagging entities in Dynatrace with this dynamic rule. And whoever changes something on the back end, removes or adds things, perfectly fine. We don't need to worry about it being tagged and included in the management zone.
Mm-hmm. That's a great tip and trick. I mean, awesome. And obviously you have also shown that this not only works on some of the small sample apps we typically show, but this works in real life, large scale environments. And that's the nice thing about this.
This was actually born in a very, very large environment. We needed to find a solution in an environment with multiple thousand hosts and services with different responsibilities that were organized in management zones. So, but it also is fun in small environments. It opens a lot of new possibilities if you use that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
So this is another example how to use this with entities with no tagging support. I just put the rules in there, right? Mm-hmm. The other one from web down was basically top down, and you can also do this bottom up, right? Mm-hmm. Nice thing with relationships is they work both directions, right? Yeah. There's a from relationship and a to relationship. Mm-hmm. And in this case, the tag entry point is the Kubernetes cluster. So basically the infrastructure that has a name, Kubernetes cluster _dev, and it just tags everything from the bottom up up to the application and the synthetic test. So it works in both directions. Mm-hmm. And this example has one rule in there that does not have tagging support, which is the container group instance, right? Mm-hmm. And it could happen if you don't have permissions in a management zone. You have permissions on the application, on the Kubernetes cluster, the process groups, but you can't go down into the container group instance. That can happen. I was pretty surprised that this would basically a management zone rule would rule that out, but it is that case, and it's a different entity that is not included in the management zone. And with that tagging support, we solved that problem, right?
Yeah.
And why do you want to apply tags to different entities as well? It's not only management zone. Another use case that I found is if, for example, you make use of the API to extract some data, right? Metrics about your container group instances, for example, right? Mm-hmm. I know there's different ways that you can get that in Dynatrace as well, but there are a couple of entities in Dynatrace that you can't natively tag, but via the API you can tag them, and you can also ask for them or filter by those tags then via the API, right? It's a corner case, but it's just a nice finding that I discovered as well, that you can tag specific things and then you can use them in filter if you want to have them in API requests, even if they cannot see in the UI. So for example, container group instance, you don't even see the tags. Mm-hmm. But sure, if that's correct, but there are some entities where you can't see the tags in the UI, and you can only see them in the API.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I can also think of the use cases around quality gates, release validation. So we talk a lot about using metric expressions to say, give me the CPU, the throughput, give me certain metrics that come from my application or from my environment. And in your case, you just automatically push the tag through, and then you can pull that metric in as part of your delivery process, and then say, hey, actually worked, or no, the metric is not good based on the tag. Yeah, this is really cool.
Yeah, there are even some entity types, unfortunately, that you cannot tag, what the API or Dynatrace basically says, well, this is not an entity type that supports tagging. So there's some little room for improvement. Some entities you cannot tag, neither via such a rule or via the API. And then there is entities that you can tag with a rule, but you cannot include them in a selector and a management zone. So there's a little bit room for improvement. As I said, there's lots of use cases where this might make sense that is not obviously visible in the first view on the UI, but yeah.
Cool. Hey, Reinhard, thank you so much. If you want to do me the favor and go to the last slide to remind everybody again about your name. You're managing director at 360 Performance. You're doing a lot of Dynatrace implementation work with large customers, as we've seen. And I'm really glad that you are sharing these tips and tricks with the community. And thanks to people like you, the community is better off, right? Because we're sharing this, and also your plugins. Great work, and hope to have you back for more topics in the future.
Definitely. I say thank you, Andy, and thanks for having this opportunity.
Yeah. Last words for me, folks. If you are a Dynatrace user as well, and you have your tips and tricks that you use on a daily basis, just let us know. I'm happy to get you on another community episode. Also, make sure to check the links in the description. We're going to link to the plugin, to the community pages that Reinhard mentioned. If you're completely new to Dynatrace, you can also see, you can just sign up for a Dynatrace trial. Try it yourself, right? You see the great stuff people are doing. And with this, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.